Encyclical Letter of the Holy Father Francis, The Care of Our Common Home, Chapter 4, Integral Ecology. Since everything is closely interrelated, and today's problems call for a vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crisis, I suggest that we now consider some elements of the integral ecology, one which clearly respects its human and social dimensions. 1. Environmental, economic, and social ecology. Ecology studies the relationship between living organisms and the environment in which they develop. This necessarily entails reflection and debate about the conditions required for the life and survival of society, and the honesty needed to question certain models of development, production, and consumption. It cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. Time and space are not independent of one another, and not even atoms or subatomic particles can be considered in isolation. Just as the different aspects of the planet, physical, chemical, and biological, are interrelated, so too living species are part of a network, which we will never fully explore and understand. A good part of our genetic code is shared by many living beings. It follows that the fragmentation of knowledge and the isolation of bits of information can actually become a form of ignorance, unless they are integrated into a broader view of reality. When we speak of the environment, what we really mean is a relationship existing between nature and the society which lives in it. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves, or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. Recognizing the reasons why a given area is polluted requires a study of the workings of society, its economy, its behavior patterns, and the way it grasps reality. Given the scale of change, it is no longer possible to find a specific, discrete answer for each part of the problem. It is essential to seek comprehensive solutions which consider the interactions with the natural systems themselves and with social systems. We are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and, at the same time, protecting nature. Due to the number and variety of factors to be taken into account when determining the environmental impact of a concrete undertaking, it is essential to give researchers their due role, to facilitate their interactions, and to ensure broad academic freedom. Ongoing research should also give us a better understanding of how different creatures relate to one another in making up the larger units which today we term ecosystems. We take these systems into account not only to determine how best to use them, but also because they have an intrinsic value independent of their usefulness. Each organism, as a creature of God, is good and admirable in itself. The same is true of the harmonious ensemble of organisms existing in a definite space and functioning as a system. Although we are often not aware of it, we depend on these large systems for our own existence. We need only recall how ecosystems interact in dispersing carbon dioxide, purified water, controlling illness and epidemics, forming soil, breaking down waste, and in many other ways we overlook or simply ignore. Once they become conscious of this, many people realize that we live and act on the basis of a reality which has previously been given to us, which precedes our existence and our abilities. So, when we speak of sustainable use, consideration must always be given to each ecosystem's regenerative ability in its different areas and aspects. Economic growth, for its part, tends to produce predictable reactions and a certain standardization, with the aim of simplifying procedures and reducing costs. This suggests the need for an economic ecology, capable of appealing to a broader vision of reality. The protection of the environment is, in fact, the integral part of the development process and cannot be considered in isolation from it. We urgently need a humanism capable of bringing together the different fields of knowledge, including economics, in the service of a more integral and integrating vision. Today, the analysis of environmental problems cannot be separated from the analysis of human, family, work-related, and urban contexts, nor from how individuals relate to themselves, which leads in turn to how they relate to others and to the environment. There is an interrelation between ecosystems and between the various spheres of social interaction, demonstrating yet again that the whole is greater than the part. If everything is related, then the health of a society's institutions has consequences for the environment and the quality of human life. Every violation of solidarity and civic friendship harms the environment. In this sense, social ecology is necessarily institutional and gradually extends to the whole of society, from the primary social group, the family, to the wider local, national, and international communities. Within each social stratum and between them, institutions develop to regulate human relationships. Anything which weakens those institutions has negative consequences, such as injustice, violence, and loss of freedom. A number of countries have a relatively low level of institutional effectiveness, which results in greater problems for their people while benefiting those who profit from this situation. Whether in the administration of the state, the various levels of civil society, or relationships between individuals themselves, lack of respect for the law is becoming more commonplace. Laws may well be framed, yet remain a dead letter. Can we hope, then, that in such cases legislation and regulations dealing with the environment will really prove effective? We know, for example, that countries which have clear legislation about the protection of forests continue to keep silent as they watch laws repeatedly being broken. Moreover, what takes place in any one area can have a direct or indirect influence on other areas. Thus, for example, drug use in affluent societies creates a continual and growing demand for products imported from poorer regions, where behavior is corrupted, lives are destroyed, and the environment continues to deteriorate. 2. Cultural ecology. Together with the patrimony of nature, there is also a historic, artistic, and cultural patrimony, which is likewise under threat. This patrimony is a part of the shared identity of each place and a foundation upon which to build a habitable city. It is not a matter of tearing down and building new cities supposedly more respectful for the environment, yet not always more attractive to live in. Rather, there is a need to incorporate the history, culture, and architecture of each place, thus preserving its original identity. Ecology, then, also involves protecting the cultural treasures of humanity in the broadest sense. More specifically, it calls for greater attention to local cultures when studying environmental problems, favoring a dialogue between scientific technical language and the language of the people. Culture is more than what we have inherited from the past. It is also, above all, a living, dynamic, and participatory present reality, which cannot be excluded when we rethink the relationship between human beings and the environment. A consumerist vision of human beings, encouraged by the mechanisms of today's globalized economy, has a leveling effect on cultures, diminishing the immense variety which is the heritage of all humanity. Attempts to resolve all problems through uniform regulations or technical interventions can lead to overlooking the complexities of local problems, which demand the active participation of all members of the community. New processes taking shape can not always fit into the frameworks imported from outside. They need to be based in the local culture itself. As life and the world are dynamic realities, so our care for the world must also be flexible and dynamic. Merely technical solutions run the risk of addressing symptoms and not the more serious underlying problems. There is a need to respect the rights of people's people and cultures, and to appreciate that the development of a social group presupposes an historic process which takes place within the cultural context and demands the constant and active involvement of local people from within their proper culture. Nor can the notion of the quality of life be imposed from without, for quality of life must be understood within the world of symbols and customs proper to each human group. Many intensive forms of environmental exploitation and degradation not only exhaust the resources which provide local communities with their livelihood, but also undo the social structures which, for a long time, shaped cultural identity and their sense of the meaning of life and community. The disappearance of a culture can be just as serious, or even more serious, than the disappearance of a species of plant or animal. The imposition of a dominant lifestyle linked to a single form of production can be just as harmful as the altering of ecosystems. In this sense, it is essential to show special care for indigenous communities and for their cultural traditions. They are not merely one minority amongst others, but should be the principal dialogue partners, especially when large projects affecting their land are proposed. For them, land is not a commodity, but rather a gift from God, and from their ancestors who rest there, a sacred space with which they need to interact if they are to maintain their identity and values. When they remain on their land, they themselves care for it best. Nevertheless, in various parts of the world, pressure is being put on them to abandon their homelands and to make room for agricultural or mining projects which are undertaken without regard to the degradation of nature and culture. 3. Ecology of daily life. Authentic development includes efforts to bring about an integral improvement in the quality of human life. This entails considering the setting in which people live their lives. These settings influence the way we think, feel, and act. In our rooms, our homes, our workplaces, and neighborhoods, we use our environment as a way of expressing our identity. We make every effort to adapt to our environment, but when it is disorderly, chaotic, or saturated with noise and ugliness, such overstimulation makes it difficult to find ourselves integrated and happy. An admirable creativity and generosity is shown by persons and groups who respond to environmental limitations by alleviating the adverse effects of their surroundings and learning to live their lives amid disorder and uncertainty. For example, in some places where the facades of buildings are derelict, people show great care for the interior of their homes, or find contentment in the kindness and friendliness of others. A wholesome social life can light up a seemingly undesirable environment. At times, a commendable human ecology is practiced by the poor despite numerous hardships. The feeling of asphyxiation brought on by densely populated residential areas is countered if close and warm relationships develop, if communities are created, if the limitations of the environment are compensated for in the interior of each person who feels held within a network of solidarity and belonging. In this way, any place can turn from being a hell on earth into a setting for a dignified life. The extreme poverty experienced in areas lacking harmony, open spaces, or potential for integration can lead to incidents of brutality and to exploitation by criminal organizations. In the unstable neighborhoods of megacities, the daily experience of overcrowding and social anonymity can create a sense of uprootedness which spawns antisocial behavior and violence. Nonetheless, I wish to insist that love always proves more powerful. Many people in these conditions are able to weave bonds of belonging and togetherness, which convert overcrowding into an experience of community in which the walls of the egos are torn down and the barriers of selfishness overcome. This experience of a communitarian salvation often generates creative ideas for the improvement of a building or a neighborhood. Given the interrelationship between living space and human behavior, those who design buildings, neighborhoods, public spaces, and cities ought to draw on the various disciplines which help us to understand people's thought processes, symbolic language, and ways of acting. It is not enough to seek the beauty of design. More precious still is the service we offer to another kind of beauty, people's quality of life, their adaptation to the environment, encounter, and mutual assistance. Here, too, we see how important it is that urban planning always take into consideration the views of those who will live in the areas. There is also a need to protect those common areas, visual landmarks, and urban landscapes, which increase our sense of belonging, our rootedness, our feeling at home within a city, which includes us and brings us together. It is important that the different parts of a city be well integrated and that those who live there have a sense of the whole, rather than being confined to one neighborhood and failing to see the larger city as space which they share with others. Interventions which affect the urban or rural landscape should take into account how various elements combine to form a whole which is perceived by its inhabitants as a coherent and meaningful framework for their lives. Others will then no longer be seen as strangers, but as part of a we, which all of us are working to create. For this same reason, in both urban and rural settings, it is helpful to set aside some places which can be preserved and protected from constant changes brought by human intervention. Lack of housing is a grave problem in many parts of the world, both in rural areas and in large cities, since state budgets usually cover only a small portion of the demand. Not only the poor, but many other members of society as well find it difficult to own a home. Having a home has much to do with a sense of personal dignity and the growth of families. This is a major issue for human ecology. In some places, where makeshift shanty towns have sprung up, this will mean developing those neighborhoods rather than raising or displacing them. When the poor live in unsanitary slums or in dangerous tenements, in cases where it is necessary to relocate them, in order not to heap suffering upon suffering, adequate information needs to be given beforehand, with choices of decent housing offered, and the people directly involved must be part of the process. At the same time, creativity should be shown in integrating run-down neighborhoods into a welcoming city. How beautiful those cities which overcome paralyzing mistrust, integrate those who are different, and make this very integration a new factor of development. How attractive are those cities which, even in their architectural design, are full of spaces which connect, relate, and favor the recognition of others. The quality of life in cities has much to do with systems of transport, which are often a source of much suffering for those who use them. Many cars used by one or more people circulate in cities, causing traffic congestion, raising the level of pollution, and consuming enormous quantities of non-renewable energy. This makes it necessary to build more roads and parking areas, which spoil the urban landscape. Many specialists agree on the need to give priority to public transportation, yet some measures needed will not prove easily acceptable to society unless substantial improvements are made in the systems themselves, which in many cities force people to put up with undignified conditions due to crowding, inconvenience, infrequent service, and lack of safety. Respect for our dignity as human beings often jars with the chaotic realities that people have to endure in city life. Yet this should not make us overlook the abandonment and neglect also experienced by some rural populations, which lack access to essential services and where some workers are reduced to conditions of servitude, without rights or even the hope of a more dignified life. Human ecology also implies another profound reality, the relationship between human life and the moral law, which is inscribed in our nature and is necessary for the creation of a more dignified environment. Pope Benedict the 16th spoke of an ecology of man based on the fact that man too has a nature that he must respect and that he cannot manipulate at will. It is enough to recognize that our body itself establishes in a direct relationship with the environment and our body itself establishes us in direct relationship with the environment and with other living beings. The acceptance of our bodies as God's gift is vital for welcoming and accepting the entire world as a gift from the Father and our common home, whereas thinking that we enjoy absolute power over our own bodies turns often subtly into thinking that we enjoy absolute power over creation. Learning to accept our body, to care for it, and to respect its fullest meaning is an essential element of any genuine human ecology. Also, valuing one's own body in its femininity or masculinity is necessary if I am going to be able to recognize myself in an encounter with someone who is different. In this way, we can joyfully accept the special gifts of another man or woman, the work of God, the Creator, and find mutual enrichment. It is not a healthy attitude which would seek to cancel out sexual difference because it can no longer knows how to confront it. 4. The principle of the common good. An integral ecology is inseparable from the notion of the common good, a central and unifying principle of social ethics. The common good is the sum of those conditions of social life which allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment. Underlying the principles of the common good is respect for the human person as such, endowed with the basic and inalienable rights ordered to his or her integral development. It has also to do with the overall welfare of society and the development of a variety of intermediate groups applying the principle of subsidiary. Outstanding among those groups is the family as the basic cell of society. Finally, the common good calls for social peace, the stability and security provided by a certain order which cannot be achieved without particular concern for distributive justice. Whenever this is violated, violence always ensues. Society as a whole, and the state in particular, are obliged to defend and promote the common good. In the present condition of global society, where injustices abound and growing numbers of people are deprived of basic human rights and considered expendable, the principle of the common good immediately becomes, logically and inevitably, a summons to solidarity and a preferential option for the poorest of our brothers and sisters. This option entails recognizing the implications of the universal destination of the world's goods. But, as I mentioned in the apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, it demands that before all else an appreciation of the immense dignity of the poor in light of our deepest convictions as believers. We need only look around us to see that today this option is in fact an ethical imperative essential for effectively attaining the common good. 5. Justice between generations. The notion of the common good also extends to future generations. The global economic crisis have made painfully obvious the detrimental effects of disregarding our common destiny, which cannot exclude those who come after us. We can no longer speak of sustainable development apart from intergenerational solidarity. Once we start to think about the kind of world we are leaving to the future generations, we look at things differently. We realize that the world is a gift which we have freely received and must share with others. Since the world has been given to us, we can no longer view reality in a purely utilitarian way, in which efficiency and productivity are entirely geared to our individual benefit. Intergenerational solidarity is not optional, but rather a basic question of justice, since the world we have received also belongs to those who will follow us. The Portuguese bishops have called upon us to acknowledge this obligation of justice. The environment is part of a logic of receptivity. It is on loan to each generation, which must then hand it on to the next. An integral ecology is marked by this broader vision. What kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to our children who are now growing up? This question not only concerns the environment in isolation. These issues cannot be approached piecemeal. When we ask ourselves what kind of world we want to leave behind, we think in the first place of its general direction, its meaning, and its values. Unless we struggle with these deeper issues, I do not believe that our concern for ecology will produce significant results. But if those issues are courageously faced, we are led to inexorably to ask other pointed questions. What is the purpose of our life in this world? Why are we here? What is the goal of our work and all our efforts? What need does the earth have of us? It is no longer enough then simply to state that we should be concerned for future generations. We need to see that what is at stake is our own dignity. Leaving an inhabitable planet to future generations is, first and foremost, up to us. The issue is one which dramatically affects us, for it has to do with the ultimate meaning of our earthly sojourn. Doomsday predictions can no longer be met with irony or disdain. We may well be leaving to coming generations debris, desolation, and filth. The pace of consumerism, waste, and environmental change has so stretched the planet's capacity, and our contemporary lifestyle, unsustainable as it is, can only precipitate catastrophes, such as those which even now periodically occur in different areas of the world. The effects of the present imbalance can only be reduced by our decisive action, here and now. We need to reflect on our accountability before those who will have to endure the dire consequences. Our difficulty in taking up this challenge seriously has much to do with the ethical and cultural decline which has accompanied the deterioration of the environment. Men and women of our postmodern world run the risk of rampant individualism, and many problems of society are connected with today's self-centered culture of instant gratification. We see this in the crisis of family and the social ties and the difficulties of recognizing the other. Parents can be prone to impulsive and wasteful consumption, which then affects their children, who find it increasingly difficult to acquire a home of their own and build a family. Furthermore, our inability to think seriously about future generations is linked to our inability to broaden the scope of our present interests and give consideration to those who remain excluded from development. Let us not only keep the poor of the future in mind, but also today's poor, whose life on this earth is brief and who cannot keep on waiting. Hence, in addition to a fairer sense of intergenerational solidarity, there is also an urgent moral need for a renewed sense of intergenerational solidarity. Chapter 5. Lines of Approach and Action. So far I have attempted to take stock of our present situation, pointing to the cracks in the planet that we inhabit, as well as to the profoundly human causes of environmental degradation. Although the contemplation of this reality in itself has already shown the need for a change of direction and other courses of action, now I shall try to outline the major paths of dialogue which can help us escape the spiral of self-destruction which currently engulfs us. 1. Dialogue on the environment in the international community. Beginning in the middle of the last century, and overcoming many difficulties, there has been a growing conviction that our planet is a homeland, and that humanity is one people living in a common home. An interdependent world not only makes us more conscious of the negative effects of certain lifestyles and models of production and consumption which affect us all. More importantly, it motivates us to ensure that solutions are proposed for a global perspective, and not simply to defend the interests of a few countries. Interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. Yet the same ingenuity which has brought about enormous technological progress has so far proved incapable of finding effective ways of dealing with grave environmental and social problems worldwide. A global consensus is essential for confronting the deeper problems, which cannot be resolved by unilateral actions on the part of individual countries. So such a consensus could lead, for example, to planning a sustainable and diversified agriculture, developing renewable and less polluting forms of energy, encouraging a more efficient use of energy, promoting a better management of marine and forest resources, and ensuring universal access to drinking water. We know that technology based on the use of highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, but also oil, and to a lesser degree gas, needs to be progressively replaced without delay. Until greater progress is made in developing widely accessible sources of renewable energy, it is legitimate to choose the less harmful alternative or to find short-term solutions. But the international community has still not reached adequate agreement about the responsibility for paying the costs of this energy transition. In recent decades, environmental issues have given rise to considerable public debate and have elicited a variety of committed and generous civic responses. Politics and businesses have been slow to react in a way commiserate with the urgency of the challenges facing our world. Although the post-industrial period may well be remembered as one of the most irresponsible in history, nevertheless there is reason to hope that humanity, at the dawn of the 21st century, will be remembered for having generously shouldered its grave responsibilities. Worldwide, the ecological movement has made significant advances, thanks also to efforts of many organizations of civil society. It is impossible here to mention them all, or to review the history of their contributions, but thanks to their efforts, environmental questions have increasingly found a place on the public agendas and encouraged more far-sighted approaches. This notwithstanding, recent world summits on the environment have not lived up to expectations because, due to lack of political will, they were unable to reach truly meaningful and effective global agreements on the environment. In the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro is worth mentioning. It proclaimed that human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. Echoing the 1972 Stockholm Declaration, it enshrined international cooperation to care for the ecosystems of the entire Earth, the obligation of those who cause pollution to assume its costs, and the duty to assess the environmental impact of given projects and works. It set the goal of limiting greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere in an effort to reverse the trend of global warming. It also drew up an agenda with an action plan and a convention on biodiversity and stated principles regarding forests. Although the summit was a real step forward and prophetic for its time, its accords have been poorly implemented due to the lack for suitable mechanisms of oversight, periodic review, and penalties in cases of noncompliance. The principles which it proclaims still await an efficient and flexible means of practical implementation. Among positive experiences in this regard, we might mention, for example, the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste, with its system of reporting standards and controls. There is also the Binding Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which includes on-site visits for verifying effective compliance. Thanks to the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer and its implementation through the Montreal Protocol and amendments, the problems of the layers thinning seems to have entered a phase of resolution. As far as the protection of biodiversity and issues related to desertification are concerned, progress has been far less significant. With regard to climate change, the advances have been regrettably few. Reducing greenhouse gases requires honesty, courage, and responsibility, above all on the part of these countries, which are more powerful and pollute the most. The Conference of the United Nations on Sustainable Development, Rio de Janeiro 2012, issued a wide-ranging but ineffectual outcome document. International negotiations cannot make significant progress due to positions taken by countries which place their national interests above the global common good. Those who will have to suffer the consequences of what we are trying to hide will not forget this failure of conscience and responsibility. Even as this encyclical was being prepared, the debate was intensifying. We believers cannot fail to ask God for a positive outcome to the present discussions so that future generations will not have to suffer the effects of our ill-advised delays. Some strategies for lowering pollutant gas emissions call for the internationalization of environmental costs, which would risk imposing on countries with fewer resources burdensome commitments to reducing emissions comparable to those of far more industrialized countries. Imposing such measures penalizes these countries most in need of development. A further injustice is perpetuated under the guise of protecting the environment. Here also the poor end up paying the price. Furthermore, since the effects of climate change will be felt for a long time to come, even if stringent measures are taken now, some countries with scarce resources will require assistance in adapting to the effects already being produced, which affect their economies. In this context, there is a need for common and differentiated responsibilities. As the Bishop of Bolivia's bishops of Bolivia have stated, the countries which have benefited from a high degree of industrialization at the cost of enormous emissions of greenhouse gases have a greater responsibility for providing a solution to the problems they have caused. The strategy of buying and selling carbon credits can lead to a new form of speculation which would not help to reduce emissions of polluting gases worldwide. This system seems to provide a quick and easy solution under the guise of a certain commitment to the environment, but in no way does it allow for the radical change which present circumstances require. Rather, it may simply become a ploy which permits maintaining excessive consumption of some countries and sectors. For poor countries, their priorities must be to eliminate extreme poverty and to promote social development of their people. At the same time, they need to acknowledge the scandalous level of consumption in some privileged sectors of their population and to combat corruption most effectively. They are likewise bound to develop less polluting forms of energy production, but to do so they require the help of countries which have experienced great growth at the cost of the ongoing pollution of the planet. Taking advantage of abundant solar energy will require the establishment of mechanisms and subsidies which allow developing countries access to technology transfer, technical assistance, and financial resources, but in a way which respects their concrete situation, since the compatibility of infrastructures with the context for which they have been designed is not always adequately addressed. The costs of this would be low compared to the risks of climate change. In any event, these are primarily ethical decisions rooted in solidarity between peoples. Enforceable international agreements are urgently needed since local authorities are not always capable of effective intervention. Relations between states must be respectful of each other's sovereignty, but must also lay down mutually agreed means of averting regional disasters, which would eventually affect everyone. Global regulatory norms are needed to impose obligations and prevent unacceptable actions, for example, more powerful companies or countries dump contaminated waste or offshore polluting industries in other countries. Let us also mention the system of governance of the oceans. International and regional conventions do exist, but fragmentation and the lack of strict mechanisms of regulations, control, and penalizations end up undermining these efforts. The growing problem of marine waste and the protection of the open seas represents a particular challenge. What is needed, in effect, is an agreement on systems of governance for the whole range of so-called global concerns. The same mindset which stands in the way of making radical decisions to reverse the trends of global warming also stand in the way of achieving the goal of eliminating poverty. A more responsible overall approach is needed to deal with both problems, the reduction of pollution and the development of poorer countries and regions. The 21st century, while maintaining systems of governance inherited from the past, is witnessing a weakening of the power of nation-states, chiefly because the economic and financial sectors, being transnational, tend to prevail over the political. Given this situation, it is essential to devise stronger and more efficiently organized international institutions, both with functionaries who are appointed fairly by agreement among national governments and empowered to impose sanctions. As Benedict XVI has affirmed in continuity with the social teaching of the Church, to manage the global economy, to revive economies hit by the crisis, to avoid any deterioration of the present crisis and greater imbalances that would result, to bring about integral and timely disarmament, food security and peace, to guarantee the protection of the environment, and to regulate mitigation. For all this there is urgent need of a true world political authority, as my predecessor, Blessed John the 23rd, indicated some years ago. Diplomacy also takes on new importance in the work of developing international strategies which can anticipate serious problems affecting us all. 2. Dialogue for new national and local policies. There are not just winners and losers among countries, but within poor countries themselves. Hence, different responsibilities need to be identified. Questions related to the environment and economic development can no longer be approached only from the standpoint of differences between countries. They also call for greater attention to policies on the national and local levels. Given the real potential for a misuse of human abilities, individual states can no longer ignore their responsibility for planning, coordination, oversight, and enforcement within their respective borders. How can a society plan and project its future amid constantly developing technological innovations? One authoritative source of oversight and coordination is the law, which lays down rules for admissible conduct in the light of the common good. The limits which a healthy, mature, and sovereign society must impose are those related to foresight and security, regulatory norms, timely enforcement, the elimination of corruption, effective responses to undesirable side effects of production processes, and appropriate intervention where potential or uncertain risks are involved. There is a growing jurisprudence dealing with the reduction of pollution by business activities, but political and institutional frameworks do not exist simply to avoid bad practice, but also to promote best practice, to stimulate creativity in seeking new solutions, and to encourage individual and group initiatives. A politics concerned with immediate results, supported by consumerist sectors of the population, is driven to produce short-term growth. In response to electoral interests, governments are reluctant to upset the public with measures which could affect the level of consumption or create risks for foreign investment. The myopia of power politics delays the inclusion of far-sighted environmental agenda, wherein the overall agenda of the myopia of power politics delays the inclusion of far-sighted environmental agenda within the overall agenda of governments. Thus, we forget that time is greater than space, that we are always more effective when we generate processes rather than holding on to positions of power. True statecraft is manifest when, in difficult times, we uphold high principles and think of the long-term common good. Political powers do not find it easy to assume this duty in the work of nation-building. In some places, cooperatives are being developed to exploit renewable resources of energy, which ensure local self-sufficiency and even the sale of surplus energy. A simple example shows that while the existing world order proves powerless to assume its responsibilities, local individuals and groups can make a real difference. They are able to instill a greater sense of responsibility, a strong sense of community, a readiness to protect others, a spirit of creativity, and a deep love for the land. They are also concerned about what they will eventually leave to their children and grandchildren. These values are deeply rooted in indigenous people. Because the enforcement of laws is at times inadequate due to corruption, public pressure has to be exerted in order to bring about decisive political action. Society, through non-governmental organizations and intermediate groups, must put pressure on the governments to develop more rigorous regulations, procedures, and controls. Unless citizens control political power, national, regional, and municipal, it will not be possible to control damage to the environment. Local legislation can be more effective, too, if agreements exist between neighboring communities to support the same environmental policies. There are no uniform recipes because each country or region has its own problems and limitations. It is also true that political realism may call for transnational measures and technologies, so long as these are accompanied by the gradual framing and acceptance of binding commitments. At the same time, on the national and local levels, much still needs to be done, such as promoting ways of conserving energy. These would include favoring forms of industrial production with maximum energy efficiency and diminished use of raw materials, removing from the market products which are less energy efficient or more polluting, improving a transport system, and encouraging the construction and repair of buildings aimed at reducing their energy consumption and levels of pollution. Political activity on the local level could also be directed to modifying consumption, developing an economy of waste disposal and recycling, protecting certain species, and planning a diversified agriculture and the rotation of crops. Agriculture in poorer regions can be improved through investment in rural infrastructure, a better organization of local and national markets, systems of irrigation, and the development of techniques of sustainable agriculture. New forms of cooperation and community organizations can be encouraged in order to defend the interests of small producers and preserve local ecosystems from destruction. Truly, much can be done. Here, continuity is essential because policies related to climate change and the environmental protection cannot be altered with every change of government. Results take time and demand immediate outlays, which may not produce tangible effects within any one government's term. This is why, in the absence of pressure from the public and from civic institutions, political authorities will always be reluctant to intervene, all the more when urgent needs must be met. To take up these responsibilities and the costs they entail, politicians will inevitably clash with the mindset of short-term gains and results which dominates present-day economies and politics. But if they are courageous, they will attest to their God-given dignity and will leave behind a testimony of selfless responsibility. A healthy politics is sorely needed, capable of reforming and coordinating institutions, promoting best practices, and overcoming undue pressure and bureaucratic inertia. It should be added, though, that even the best mechanisms can break down when there are no worthy goals and values, or a genuine and profound humanism to serve on the basis of a noble and generous society. 3. Dialogue and transparency in decision-making. An assessment of the environmental impact of business ventures and projects demands transparent political processes involving a free exchange of views. On the other hand, the forms of corruption which conceal the actual environmental impact of a given project in exchange for favors usually produce specious agreements which fail to inform adequately and to allow for full debate. Environmental impact assessment should not come after the drawing up of a business proposal or the proposal of a particular policy, plan, or program. It should be part of the process from the beginning and be carried out in a way which is interdisciplinary, transparent, and free of all economic or political pressure. It should be linked to a study of working conditions and possible effects on people's physical and mental health, on the local economy, and on public safety. Economic returns can thus be forecast more realistically, taking into account potential scenarios and the eventual needs for further investment to correct possible undesirable effects. A consensus should always be reached when the different stakeholders who can offer a variety of approaches, solutions, and alternatives. The local population should have a special place at the table. They are concerned with their own future and that of their children, and can consider goals transcending immediate economic interests. We need to stop thinking in terms of interventions to save the environment in favor of policies developed and debated by all interested parties. The participation of the latter also entails being fully informed about such projects and their different risks and possibilities. This includes not just preliminary decisions, but also various follow-up activities and continued monitoring. Honesty and truth are needed in scientific and political discussions. These should not be limited to the issue of whether or not a particular project is permitted by law. In face of possible risks to the environment which may affect the common good now and in the future, decisions must be made based on a comparison of the risks and benefits foreseen for the various possible alternatives. This is especially the case when a project may lead to the greater use of natural resources, higher levels of emissions or discharge, an increase of refuse, or significant changes in the landscape, the habitants of protected species, or public spaces. Some projects, if insufficiently studied, can profoundly affect the quality of life of an area due to different factors such as unforeseen noise pollution, the shrinking of visual horizons, the loss of cultural values, or the effects of nuclear energy use. The culture of consumerism, which prioritizes short-term gain and private interest, can make it easy to rubber stamp authorizations or to conceal information. In any discussion about a proposed venture, a number of questions need to be asked in order to discern whether or not it will contribute to genuine, integral development. What will it accomplish? Why? Where? When? How? For whom? What are the risks? What are the costs? Who will pay the costs and how? Is this discernment discernment, some questions might be higher priority. For example, we know that water is scarce and an indispensable resource. Water is a scarce and indispensable resource and a fundamental right, which conditions the exercise of other human rights. This indispensable fact overrides any other assessment of environmental impact on a region. The Rio Declaration of 1992 states that where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a pretext for postponing cost-effective measures, which prevent environmental degradation. This precautionary principle makes it possible to protect those who are most vulnerable and whose ability to defend their interests and to assemble incontrovertible evidence is limited. If objective information suggests that serious and irreversible damage will result, a project should be halted or modified even in the absence of indispensable proof. Here, the burden of proof is effectively reversed, since in such cases objective and conclusive demonstrations will have to be brought forward to demonstrate that the proposed activity will not cause serious harm to the environment or those who inhabit it, or to those who inhabit it. This does not mean being opposed to any technological innovation which can bring about an improvement in the quality of life, but it does mean that profit cannot be the sole criterion to be taken into account, and that, when significant new information comes to light, a reassessment should be made with the involvement of all interested parties. The outcome may be a decision not to proceed with a given project, to modify it, or to consider alternative proposals. There are certain environmental issues where it is not easy to achieve a broad consensus. Here I would state once more that the Church does not presume to settle scientific questions or to replace politics. But I am concerned to encourage an open and honest debate so that particular interests or ideologies will not prejudice the common good. 4. Politics and economy in dialogue for human fulfillment. Politics must not be subject to the economy, nor should the economy be subject to the dictates or the efficiently driven paradigm of technocracy. Today, in view of the common good, there is urgent need for politics and economics to enter into frank dialogue in the service of life, especially human life, saving banks at any cost, making the public pay the price, foregoing a firm commitment to reviewing and reforming the entire system, only reaffirms the absolute power of financial systems, a power which has no future and will only give rise to new crises after a slow, costly, and only apparent recovery. The financial crisis of 2007-2008 provided an opportunity to develop a new economy more attentive to ethical principles and new ways of regulating speculative financial practices and virtual wealth. But the response to the crisis did not include rethinking the outdated criteria, which continue to rule the world. Production is not always rational, and is usually tied to economic variables, which assign to products a value that does not necessarily correspond to their real worth. This frequently leads to an overproduction of some commodities with unnecessary impact on the environment, and with negative results on regional economies. The financial bubble also tends to be a productive bubble. The problem of the real economy is not confronted with vigor. Yet it is the real economy which makes diversification and improvement in production possible, helps companies to function well, and enables small and medium businesses to develop and create employment. Here, too, it should always be kept in mind that environmental protection cannot be assured solely on the basis of financial calculations of costs and benefits. The environment is one of those goods that cannot be adequately safeguarded or promoted by market forces. Once more, we need to reject a magical conception of the market which would suggest that problems can be solved simply by an increase in the profits of companies or individuals. It is realistic to hope that those who are obsessed with maximizing profits will stop to reflect on the environmental damage which they leave behind for future generations. Oh, that was a question. Is it realistic to hope that those who are obsessed with maximizing profits will stop to reflect on the environmental damage which they leave behind for future generations? Where profits alone count, There can be no thinking about the rhythms of nature, its phases of decay and regeneration, or the complexity of ecosystems which may be gravely upset by human intervention. Moreover, biodiversity is considered at most a deposit of economic resources available for exploitations, with no serious thought to the real value of things, their significance for persons and cultures, or the concern and needs of the poor. Whenever these questions are raised, some react by accusing others of irrationally attempting to stand in the way of progress and human development. But we need to grow in the conviction that a decrease in the pace of production and consumption can at times give rise to another form of progress and development. Efforts to promote a sustainable use of natural resources are not a waste of money, but rather an investment capable of providing other economic benefits in the medium term. If we look at the larger picture, we can see that the more diversified and innovative forms of production, which impact less on the environment, can prove very profitable. It is a matter of openness to different possibilities, which do not involve stifling human creativity and its ideas of progress, but rather directing that energy along new channels. For example, a path of productive development, which is more creative and better directed, could correct the present disparity between excessive technological investment in consumption and insufficient investment in resolving urgent problems facing the human family. It could generate sensible and profitable ways of reusing, revamping, and recycling, and it could also improve the energy efficiency of cities. Productive diversification offers the fullest possibilities to human ingenuity to create and innovate, while at the same time protecting the environment and creating more sources of employment. Such creativity would be a worthy expression of our most noble human qualities, for we would be striving intelligently, boldly, and responsibly to promote a sustainable and equitable development within the context of a broader concept of quality of life. On the other hand, to find ever new ways of despoiling nature purely for the sake of new consumer items and quick profit would be, in human terms, less worthy and creative, and more superficial. In any event, if in some cases sustainable development were to involve new forms of growth, in other cases, given the insatiable and irresponsible growth produced over many decades, we need to also think about containing growth by setting some reasonable limits and even retracing our steps before it's too late. We know how unsustainable is the behavior of those who constantly consume and destroy, while others are not yet able to live in a way worthy of their human dignity. This is why the time has come to accept decreased growth in some parts of the world, in order to provide resources for other places to experience healthy growth. Benedict XVI has said that technology-advanced societies must be prepared to encourage more sober lifestyles while reducing their energy consumption and improving its efficiency. For new models of progress to arise, there is a need to change models of global development. This will entail a responsible reflection on the meaning of the economy and its goals, with an eye to correcting its malfunctions and misapplications. It is not enough to balance in the medium term the protection of nature with financial gain or the preservation of the environment with progress. Halfway measures simply delay the inevitable disaster. Put simply, it is a matter of redefining our notion of progress. A technological and economic development which does not leave in its wake a better world and an integrally higher quality of life cannot be considered progress. Frequently, in fact, people's quality of life actually diminishes by the deterioration of the environment, the low quality of food, or the depletion of resources in the midst of economic growth. In this context, talk of sustainable growth usually becomes a way of distracting attention and offering excuses. It absorbs the language and values of ecologies and the categories of finance and technology, and the social and environment responsibility of businesses often gets reduced to a series of marketing and image-enhancing measures. The principle of maximization of profits, frequently isolated from other considerations, reflects a misunderstanding of the very concept of the economy. As long as production is increased, little concern is given to whether it is the cost of future generations or the health of the environment. As long as the clearing of forests increases production, No one calculates the losses entailed in the desertification of the land, the harm done to biodiversity, or the increased pollution. In a word, business profit by calculating and paying only a fraction of the costs involved. Yet only when the economic and social costs of using up shared environmental resources are recognized with transparency and fully borne by those who incur them, not by other people or future generations, can those actions be considered ethical. An instrumental way of reasoning, which proves a purely static analysis of realities in the service of the present needs, is at work, whether resources are allocated by the market or by state central planning. What happens with politics? Let us keep in mind the principle of subsidiarity, which grants freedom to develop the capacities present in every level of society, while also demanding a greater sense of responsibility for the common good from those who wield greater power. Today it is the case that some economic sectors exercise more power than states themselves, but economies without politics cannot be justified, since this would make it impossible to favor other ways of handling the various aspects of the present crisis. The mindset which leaves no room for sincere concern for the environment is the same mindset which lacks concerns for the inclusion of the most vulnerable members of society. For the current model, with its emphasis on success and self-reliance, does not appear to favor an investment in efforts to help the slow, the weak, or the less talented to find opportunities in life. What is needed is a politics which is far-sighted and capable of new, integral, and interdisciplinary approach to handling the different aspects of the crisis. Often, politics itself is responsible for the disrepute in which it is held on account of corruption and the failure to enact sound political policies. If in a given region the state does not carry out its responsibilities, some business groups can come forward in the guise of benefactors, yield real power, and consider themselves exempt from certain rules, to the point of tolerating different forms of organized crime, human trafficking, and drug trade and violence, all of which become very difficult to eradicate. If politics shows itself incapable of breaking such a perverse logic, and remains caught up in inconsequential discussions, we will continue to avoid facing the major problems of humanity. A strategy for real change calls for rethinking processes in their entirety, for it is not enough to include a few superficial ecological considerations, while failing to question the logic which underlies present-day culture. A healthy politics needs to be able to take up this challenge. Politics and the economy tend to blame each other when it comes to poverty and environmental degradation. It is to be hoped that they can acknowledge their own mistake and find forms of interaction directed to the common good. While some are concerned only with financial gain and others with holding on to or increasing their power, what we are left with are conflicts or spurious agreements, where the last thing either party is concerned about is caring for the environment and protecting those who are most vulnerable. Here, too, we see how true it is that unity is greater than conflict. 5. Religions in dialogue with science. It cannot be maintained that empirical science provides a complete explanation of life, the interplay of all creatures, and the whole of reality. This would be to breach the limits imposed by its own mythology. If we reason only within the confines of the latter, little room would be left for aesthetic sensibility, poetry, or even reason's ability to grasp the ultimate meaning and purpose of things. Even reason's ability to grasp the ultimate meaning and purpose of things. I would add that religious classics can prove meaningful in every age. They have an enduring power to open new horizons. It is reasonable and enlightened to dismiss certain writings because they arouse. Is it reasonable and enlightened to dismiss certain writings because they arose in the context of religious belief? It would be quite simplistic to think that ethical principles present themselves purely in the abstract, detached from any context. Nor does the fact that they may be couched in religious language detract from their value in public debate. The ethical principles capable of being apprehended by reason can always reappear in different guise and find expression in a variety of languages, including religious language. Any technical solution which science claims to offer will be powerless to solve the serious problems of our world if humanity loses its compass, if we lose sight of the great motivations which make it possible for us to live in harmony, to make sacrifices, and to treat others well. Believers themselves must constantly feel challenged to live in a way consonant with their faith and not to contradict it by their actions. They need to be encouraged to be ever open to God's grace and to draw constantly from their deepest convictions about love, justice, and peace. If a mistaken understanding of our own principle has at times led us to justify mistreating nature, to exercise tyranny over creation, to engage in war, injustice, and acts of violence, we believers should acknowledge that by doing so we were not faithful to the treasure of wisdom, which we have been called to protect and preserve. Cultural limitations in different areas often affected the perception of these ethical and spiritual treasures, yet by constantly returning to their sources, religions will be better equipped to respond to today's needs. The majority of people living on our planet profess to be believers. This should spur religions to dialogue among themselves for the sake of protecting nature, defending the poor, and building networks of respect and fraternity. Dialogue among the various sciences is likewise needed, since each can tend to become enclosed in its own language, while specialization leads to a certain isolation and the absolution of its own field of knowledge. This prevents us from confronting environmental problems effectively. An open and respectful dialogue is also needed between the various ecological movements, among which ideological conflicts are not infrequently encountered. The gravity of the ecological crisis demands that we all look to the common good, embarking on a path of a dialogue which requires patience, self-discipline, and generosity, always keeping in mind that realities are greater than ideas. Chapter 6. Ecological Education and Spirituality. Many things have to change course, but it is we human beings above all who need to change. We lack an awareness of our common origin, of our mutual belonging, and of a future to be shared with everyone. This basic awareness would enable the development of new convictions, attitudes, and forms of life. A great cultural, spiritual, and educational challenge stands before us, and it will demand that we set out the long path of renewal. 1. Towards a new lifestyle. Since the market tends to promote extreme consumerism in an effort to sell its products, people can easily get caught up in a whirlwind of needless buying and spending. Compulsive consumerism is one example of how the techno-economic paradigm affects individuals. Romano Giardini had already foreseen this. The gadgets and techniques forced upon him by the patterns of machine production and of abstract planning man accepts quite simply. They are the forms of life itself. To either a greater or lesser degree, mass man is convinced that his conformity is both reasonable and just. This paradigm leads people to believe that they are free so long as they have supposed freedom to consume. But those really free are the minority who wield economic and financial power. Amid this confusion, postmodern humanity has not yet achieved a new self-awareness capable of offering guidance and direction, and this lack of identity is a source of anxiety. We have too many means and only a few insubstantial ends. The current global situation engenders a feeling of instability and uncertainty, which in turn becomes a seedbed for collective selfishness. When people become self-centered and self-enclosed, their greed increases. The emptier a person's heart is, the more he or she needs things to buy, own, and consume. It becomes almost impossible to accept the limits imposed by reality. In this horizon, a genuine sense of the common good also disappears. As these attributes become more widespread, social norms are respected only to the extent that they do not clash with personal needs. So our concern cannot be limited merely to the threat of extreme weather events, but must also extend to the catastrophic consequences of social unrest. Obsession with the consumerist life cycle, above all when few are capable of maintaining it, can only lead to violence and mutual destruction. Yet all is not lost. Human beings, while capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves, choosing again what is good and making a new start despite their mental and social conditioning. We are able to take an honest look at ourselves, to acknowledge our deep dissatisfaction, and to embark on new paths of authentic freedom. No system can completely suppress our openness to what is good, true, and beautiful, of our own God-given ability to respond to His grace at work deep in our hearts. I appeal to everyone throughout the world not to forget this dignity which is ours. No one has the right to take it from us. A change in lifestyle could bring healthy pressure to bear on those who wield political, economic, and social power. This is what consumer movements accomplish by boycotting certain products. They prove successful in changing the way businesses operate, forcing them to consider their environmental footprint and their patterns of production. When social pressure affects their earnings, businesses clearly have to find ways to produce differently. This shows us great need for a sense of social responsibility on the part of consumers. Purchasing is always a moral and not simple economic act. Today, in a word, the issue of environmental degradation challenges us to examine our lifestyle. The Earth Charter asked us to leave behind a period of self-destruction and make a new start, but we have not as yet developed a universal awareness needed to achieve this. Here I would echo the courageous challenge. As never before in history, common destiny beckons us to seek a new beginning. Let ours be a time remembered for the awakening of a new reverence for life, the firm resolve to achieve sustainability, the quickening of the struggle for justice and peace, and joyful celebration of life. We are always capable of going out of ourselves toward the other. Unless we do this, other creatures will not be recognized for their true worth. We are unconcerned about caring for things for the sake of others. We fail to set limits on ourselves in order to avoid the suffering of others or the deterioration of our surrounding. Disinterested concern for others and the rejection of every form of self-centeredness and self-absorption are essential if we truly wish to care for our brothers and sisters and for the natural environment. These attitudes also attune us to the moral imperative of assessing the impact of our every action and personal decision on the world around us. If we can overcome individualism, we will truly be able to develop a different lifestyle and bring about significant changes in society. 2. Educating for the covenant between humanity and the environment. An awareness of the gravity of today's cultural and ecological crisis must be translated into new habits. Many people know that our current progress and the mere amassing of things and pleasures are not enough to give meaning and joy to the human heart, yet they feel unable to give up what the market sets before them. In those countries which should be making the greatest changes in consumer habits, young people have a new ecological sensitivity and a generous spirit, and some of them are making admirable efforts to protect the environment. At the same time, they have grown up in a milieu of extreme consumerism and affluence which makes it difficult to develop other habits. We are faced with an educational challenge. Environmental education has broadened its goals. Whereas in the beginning it was mainly centered on scientific information, conscious raising, and the prevention of environmental risks, it tends now to include a critique of the myths of the modernity grounded in a utilitarian mindset: individualism, unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, the unregulated market. It seeks also to restore the various levels of ecological equilibrium, establishing harmony within ourselves, with others, with nature and other living creatures, and with God. Environmental education should facilitate making the leap towards the transcendent, which gives ecological ethics its deepest meaning. It needs educators capable of developing an ethics of ecology and helping people, through effective pedagogy, to grow in solidarity, responsibility, and compassionate care. Yet this education, aimed at creating an ecological citizenship, is at times limited to providing information and fails to instill good habits. The existence of laws and regulations is insufficient in the long run to curb bad conduct, even when the effective means of enforcement are present. If the laws are to bring about significant long-lasting efforts, the majority of the members of society must be adequately motivated to accept them and personally transformed to respond. Only by cultivating sound virtues will people be able to make a selfless ecological commitment. A person who could afford to spend less and consume more, but regularly uses less heating and wears warmer clothes, shows the kinds of convictions and attitudes which help to protect the environment. This is the nobility in the duty of care for the creation through little daily actions, and it is wonderful how education can bring about real changes in lifestyle. Education and environmental responsibility can encourage ways of acting which directly and significantly affect the world around us, such as avoiding the use of plastic and paper, reducing water consumption, separating refuse, cooking only what can be reasonably consumed, and showing care for other living beings, using public transport or carpooling, planting trees, turning off unnecessary lights, or any number of other practices. All of these reflect a generous and worthy creativity which brings out the best in human beings. Reusing something instead of immediately discarding it, when done for the right reasons, can be an act of love which expresses our own dignity. We must not think that these efforts are not going to change the world. They benefit society, often unbeknownst to us, for they call forth a goodness which, albeit unseen, inevitably tends to spread. Furthermore, such actions can restore our sense of self-esteem. They can enable us to live more fully and to feel that life on earth is worthwhile. Ecological education can take place in a variety of settings, at school, in families, in media, in catechisms, and elsewhere. Good education plants seeds when we are young, and these continue to bear fruit throughout life. Here, though, I stress the great importance of the family, which is the place in which life, the gift of God, can be properly welcomed and protected against the many attacks to which it is exposed, and can develop in accordance with what constitutes authentic human growth. In the face of the so-called culture of death, family is the heart of the culture of life. In the family, we first learn how to show love and respect for life. We are taught the proper use of things, order and cleanliness, respect for the local ecosystem, and care for all creatures. In the family, we receive an integral education, which enables us to grow harmoniously in personal maturity. In the family, we learn to ask without demanding, to say thank you as an expression of genuine gratitude for what we have been given, to control our aggressivity and greed, and to ask forgiveness when we have caused harm. These simple gestures of heartfelt courtesy help to create a culture of shared life and respect for our surroundings. Political institutions and various other social groups are also entrusted with helping to raise people's awareness. So too is the Church. All Christian communities have an important role to play in ecological education. It is my hope that our seminaries and houses of formation will provide an education in responsible simplicity of life, in grateful contemplation of God's world, and in concern for the needs of the poor and protection of the environment. Because the stakes are so high, we need institutions empowered to impose penalties for damage inflicted on the environment, but we also need the personal qualities of self-control and willingness to learn from one another. In this regard, the relationship between a good aesthetic education and the maintenance of a healthy environment cannot be overlooked. By learning to see and appreciate beauty, we learn to reject self-interested pragmatism. If someone has not learned to stop and admire something beautiful, we should not be surprised if he or she treats everything as an object to be used and abused without scruple. If we want to bring about deep change, we need to realize that certain mindsets really do influence our behavior. Our efforts at education will be inadequate and ineffectual unless we strive to promote a new way of thinking about human beings, life, society, and our relationship with nature. Otherwise, the paradigm of consumerism will continue to advance with the help of the media and the highly effective workings of the market. 3. Ecological conversion. The rich heritage of Christian spirituality, the fruit of 20 centuries of personal and communal experience, has a precious contribution to make to the renewal of humanity. Here I would like to offer Christians a few suggestions for an ecological spirituality grounded in the convictions of our faith, since the teachings of the gospel have direct consequences for our way of thinking, feeling, and living. More than in ideas or concepts as such, I am interested in how such a spirituality can motivate us to a more passionate concern for the protection of our world. A commitment this lofty cannot be sustained by doctrine alone. Without a spirituality capable of inspiring us, without an interior impulse which encourages, motivates, nourishes, and gives meaning to our individual and communal activity, Admittedly, Christians have not always appropriated and developed the spiritual treasures bestowed by God upon the Church, where the life of the Spirit is not dissociated from the body or from nature or from worldly realities, but lived in and with them, in communion with all that surrounds us. The external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. For this reason, the ecological crisis is also a summons to profound interior conversion. It must be said that some committed and prayerful Christians, with the excuse of realism and pragmatism, tend to ridicule expressions of concern for the environment. Others are passive. They have chosen not to change their habits and thus become inconsistent. So what they all need is ecological conversion, whereby the effects of their encounter with Jesus Christ becomes evident in their relationship with the world around them. Living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It is not an optional or secondary aspect of our Christian experience. In calling to mind the figure of St. Francis of Assisi, we come to realize that a healthy relationship with creation is one dimension of overall personal conversion, which entails the recognition of our errors, sins, faults, and failures, and leads to heartfelt repentance and desire to change. The Australian bishops spoke of the importance of such conversion for achieving reconciliation with creation. To achieve such reconciliation, we must examine our lives and acknowledge the ways in which we have harmed God's creation through our actions and our failure to act. We need to experience a conversion or change of heart. Nevertheless, self-improvement on the part of individuals will not by itself remedy the extremely complex situation facing our world today. Isolated individuals can lose their ability and freedom to escape the utilitarian mindset and end up prey to an unethical consumerist bereft of social or ecological awareness. Social problems must be addressed by community networks and not simply by the sum of individual good deeds. This task will make such tremendous demands of man that he may never achieve it by individual initiative or even by united effort of men bred in an individualistic way. The work of dominating the world calls for a union of skills and a unity of achievement that can only grow from quite a different attitude. The ecological conversion needed to bring about lasting change is also a community conversion. This conversion calls for a number of attitudes which together foster a spirit of generous care, full of tenderness. First, it entails gratitude and gratuitousness, a recognition that the world is God's loving gift, and that we are called quietly and to imitate His generosity and self-sacrifice and good works. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, and your Father who sees it in secret will reward you. MT 6, 3-4. It also entails a loving awareness that we are not disconnected from the rest of the creatures, but joined in a splendid universal communion. As believers, we do not look at the world from without, but from within, conscious of the bonds with which the Father has linked us to all beings. By developing our individual God-given capacities, an ecological conversion can inspire us to greater creativity and enthusiasm in resolving the world's problems and in offering to God as a living sacrifice holy and acceptable. Romans 12:1. We do not understand our superiority as a reason for personal glory or irresponsible dominion, but rather as a different capacity which in its turn entails a serious responsibility stemming from our faith. Various convictions of our faith, developed at the beginning of this encyclical, can help us to enrich the meaning of this conversion. These include the awareness that each creature reflects something of God, and has a message to convey us, and the security that Christ has taken unto himself this material world, and now risen is intimately present to each being, surrounding it with his affection and penetrating it with his light. Then, too, there is the recognition that God created the world, writing into it an order and a dynamicism that human beings have no right to ignore. We read in the Gospel that Jesus says of the birds of the air, "Not one of them is forgotten before God." I think that's Luke 12:6. How then can we possibly mistreat them or cause them harm? I ask all Christians to recognize and to live fully this dimension of their conversion. May the power and the light of the grace we have received also be evident in our relationship to other creatures, and to the world around us. In this way we will help nurture that sublime fraternity with all creation that St. Francis of Assisi so radiantly embodied. 4. Joy and peace. Christian spirituality proposes an alternative understanding of the quality of life and encourages a prophetic and contemplative lifestyle, one capable of deep enjoyment free of the obsession with consumption. We need to take up an ancient lesson found in different religious traditions and also in the Bible. It is the conviction that less is more. A constant flood of new consumer goods can baffle the heart and prevent us from cherishing each thing in each moment. To be serenely present to each reality, however small it may be, opens us to much greater horizons of understanding and personal fulfillment. Christian spirituality proposes a growth marked by moderation and the capacity to be happy with little. It is a return to that simplicity which allows us to stop and appreciate the small things, to be grateful for the opportunities which life affords us, to be spiritually detached from what we possess, and not to succumb to sadness for what we lack. This implies avoiding the dynamic of dominion and the mere accumulation of pleasures. Such sobriety, when lived freely and consciously, is liberating. It is not a lesser life of one lived with less intensity. On the contrary, it is a way of living life to the full. In reality, those who enjoy more and live better each moment are those who have given up digging here and there, always on the lookout for what they do not have. They experience what it means to appreciate each person and each thing, learning familiarity with the simplest things and how to enjoy them. So they are able to shed unsatisfied needs, reducing their obsessiveness and weariness. Even living a little, they can have a lot, above all when they cultivate other pleasures and find satisfaction in fraternal encounters, in service, in developing their gifts, in music and art, in contact with nature, in prayer. Happiness means knowing how to limit some needs, which only diminish us, and being open to many different possibilities which life can offer. Sobriety and humanity are not favorably regarded in the last century, and yet, when there is a great general breakdown in the exercise of a certain virtue in personal and social life, it ends up causing a number of imbalances, including environmental ones. This is why it is no longer enough to speak only of the integrity of ecosystems. We have to dare to speak of the integrity of the human life, of the need to promote and unify all the great values. Once we lose our humility and become enthralled with the possibility of limitless mastery over everything, we inevitably end up harming society and the environment. It is not easy to promote this kind of healthy humanity or happy sobriety when we consider ourselves autonomous, when we exclude God from our lives and replace Him with our own ego, and think that our subjective feelings can define what is right and what is wrong. On the other hand, no one can cultivate a sober and satisfying life without being at peace with himself or herself. An adequate understanding of spirituality consists in filling out what we mean by peace, which is much more than the absence of war. Inner peace is closely related to care for ecology and for the common good because, lived out authentically, it is reflected in a balanced lifestyle together with a capacity for wonder, which takes us to a deeper understanding of life. Nature is filled with words of love, but how can we listen to them amid constant noise, intermittent interminable and nerve-wracking distractions, or the cult of appearances. Many people today sense a profound imbalance which drives them to frenetic activity and makes them feel busy, in a constant hurry which in turn leads them to ride roughshod over everything around them. This too affects how they treat the environment. An integral ecology includes taking time to recover a serene harmony with creation, reflecting on our lifestyle and our ideas, and contemplating the Creator who lives among us and surrounds us, whose presence must not be contrived, but found uncovered. We are speaking of an attitude of the heart, one which approaches life with serene attentiveness, which is capable of being fully present to someone without thinking of what comes next, which accepts each moment as a gift from God to be lived to the full. Jesus taught us this attitude when He invited us to contemplate the lilies in the field and the birds in the air, or when seeing the rich young man and knowing him restless, He looked at him with love. I think MLK 10:21. He was completely present to everyone and to everything, and in this way he showed us the way to overcome the unhealthy anxiety which makes us superficial, aggressive, and compulsive consumers. One expression of this attitude is when we stop and give thanks to God before or after meals. I ask all believers to return to this beautiful and meaningful custom. That moment of blessing, however brief, reminds us of our dependence on God for life. It strengthens our feelings of gratitude for the gifts of creation. It acknowledges those who by their labors provide us with these goods, and it reaffirms our solidarity with those in greatest need. 5. Civic and political love. Care for nature is part of a lifestyle which includes a capacity for living together and communion. Jesus reminded us that we have God as our common Father, and that this makes us brothers and sisters. Fraternal love can only be gratuitous. It can never be a means of repaying others for what they have done or will do to us. This is why it is possible to love our enemies. The same gratuitousness inspires us to love and accept the wind, the sun, and the clouds, and even though we cannot control them. In this sense, we can speak of a universal fraternity. We must regain the conviction that we need one another, that we have a shared responsibility that we have a shared responsibility for others in the world, and that being good and decent are worth it. We have had enough of immorality and the mockery of ethics, goodness, faith, and honesty. It is time to acknowledge the light-hearted superficiality that has done us no good. When the foundations of social life are corroded, what ensues are battles over conflicting interests, new forms of violence and brutality, and obstacles to the growth of a genuine culture of care for the environment. Saint Teresa of Lisieux invites us to practice our little ways of love, not to miss out on a kind word, a smile, or any small gesture which sows peace and friendship. An integral ecology is also made up of simple daily gestures which breaks with the logic of violence, exploitation, and selfishness. In the end, a world of exacerbated consumption is at the same time a world which mistreats life in all its forms. Love, overflowing with small gestures of mutual care, is also civic and political, and it makes itself felt in every action and seeks to build a better world. Love for society and commitment to the common good are outstanding expressions of a charity which affects not only relationship between individuals, but also macro relationships, social and economic and political ones. And this is why the Church set before the world the ideal of a civilization of love. Social love is the key to authentic development. In order to make society more human, more worthy of the human person, love in social life, political, economic, and cultural, must be given renewed value, becoming the constant and highest norm for all activity. In this framework, along with the importance of everyday gestures, social love moves us to devise larger strategies to halt environmental degradation and to encourage a culture of care which permeates all of society. When we feel that God is calling us to intervene with others in these social dynamics, we should realize that this too is part of our spirituality, which is an exercise in charity and, as such, matures and sanctifies us. Not everyone is called to engage directly in political life. Society is also enriched by countless array of organizations which work to promote the common good and to defend the environment, whether natural or urban. Some, for example, show concern for a public place, a building, a fountain, an abandoned monument, a landscape, a square, and to strive to protect, restore, and improve or beautify it as something belonging to everyone. Around these community actions, relationships develop and are recovered, and a new social fabric emerges. Thus, a community can break out of the indifference induced by consumerism. These actions cultivate a shared identity with a story which can be remembered and handed on. In this way, the world, the quality of life of the poorest, are cared for with a sense of solidarity which is at the same time aware that we live in a common home which God has entrusted to us. These community actions, when they express self-giving love, can also become intense spiritual experiences. 6. Sacramental signs and the celebration of rest. The universe unfolds in God who fills it completely. Hence there is a mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face. The ideal is not only to pass from the exterior to the interior to discover the action of God in the soul, but also to discover God in all beings. Saint Bonaventure teaches us that contemplation deepens the more we feel the working of God's grace with our hearts, and the better we learn to encounter God in creatures outside ourselves. St. John of the Cross taught that all the goodness present in the realities and experiences of this world is present in God eminently and infinitely, or more properly in each of these sublime realities in God. More properly, in each of these sublime realities is God. This is not because the finite things of this world are really divine, but because the mystic experiences the intimate connections between God and all beings, and thus feels that all things are God. Standing awestruck before a mountain, he or she cannot separate this experience from God, and perceives that the interior awe being lived has to be entrusted to the Lord. Mountains have heights, and they are plentiful, vast, beautiful, graceful, bright, and fragrant. These mountains are what my beloved is to me. Lonely valleys are quiet, pleasant, cool, shady, and flowing with fresh water. In the variety of their groves and in the sweet song of the birds they afford abundant recreation and delight to the senses, and in their solitude and silence they refresh us and give us rest. These valleys are what my beloved is to me. The sacraments are a privileged way in which nature is taken up by God to become a means of mediating supernatural life. Through our worship of God, we are invited to embrace the world on a different plane. Water, oil, fire, and colors are taken up in all their symbolic power and incorporated in our act of praise. The hand of that blesses us is an instrument of God's love and a reflection of the closeness of Jesus Christ, who came to accompany us on this journey of life. Water poured over the body of a child in baptism is a sign of new life. Encountering God does not mean fleeing from this world or turning our back to nature. This is especially clear in the spirituality of the Christian East. Beauty, which in the East is one of the best loved names expressing the divine harmony and the model of humanity transfigured, appears everywhere in the shape of a church, in the sounds and the colors and the lights and the scents. For Christians, all the creatures of the material universe find their true meaning in the incarnate Word, for the Son of God is incorporated in his person, part of the material Word, planting in it a seed of definitive transformation. Christianity does not reject matter, rather bodiliness is considered in all its value in the liturgical act, whereby the human body is disclosed in its inner nature as a temple of the Holy Spirit and is united with the Lord Jesus, who himself took a body for the world's salvation. It is in the Eucharist that all that has been created finds its greatest exaltation. Grace, which tends to manifest itself tangibly, found unsurpassable expression when God himself became man and gave himself as food for his creatures. The Lord, in the culmination of the mystery of the Incarnation, chose to reach our intimate depths through a fragment of matter. He comes not from above, but from within. He comes that we might find him in this world of ours. In the Eucharist, fullness is already achieved. It is the living center of the universe, the overflowing core of love, of inexhaustible life. Joined to the incarnate Son, present in the Eucharist, the whole cosmos gives thanks to God. Indeed, the Eucharist is itself an act of cosmic love. Yes, cosmic, because even when it is celebrated on the humble altar of a country church, the Eucharist is always in some way celebrated on the altar of the world. The Eucharist joins heaven and earth, it embraces and penetrates all creation. The world which came forth from God's hands returns to him in blessed and undivided adoration. In the bread of the Eucharist, creation is projected towards divination, towards the holy wedding feast, towards the unification of the Creator himself. Thus the Eucharist is also a source of light and motivation for our concerns for the environment, directing us to be stewards of all creation. On Sunday, our participation in the Eucharist has special importance. Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbath, is meant to be a day which heals our relationship with God, with ourselves, with others, and with the world. Sunday is the day of the resurrection, the first day of the new creation, whose first fruits are the Lord's risen humanity, the pledge of the final transfiguration of all created reality. It also proclaims man's eternal rest in God. In this way, Christian spirituality incorporates the value of relaxation and festivity. We tend to demean contemplative rest as something unproductive and unnecessary, but this is to do away with the very thing which is most important about work, its meaning. We are called to include in our work a dimension of receptivity and gratuity, which is quite different from mere inactivity. Rather, it is another way of working, which forms plans of our very essence. It protects human action from becoming empty activism. It also prevents that unfettered greed and sense of isolation which makes us seek personal gain to the detriment of all else. The law of weekly rest forbade work on the seventh day, so that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your maidservant and the stranger may be refreshed. Exodus 23:12. Rest opens our eyes to the larger picture and gives us renewed sensitivity to the rights of others. And so the day of rest, centered on the Eucharist, sheds its light on the whole week and motivates us to greater concern for nature and the poor. 7. The Trinity and the relationship between creatures. The Father is the ultimate source of everything, the loving and self-communicating foundation of all that exists. The Son, his reflection, through whom all things were created, united himself to this earth when he was formed in the womb of Mary. The Spirit, infinite bond of love, is intimately present at the very heart of the universe, inspiring and bringing new pathways. The world was created by the three persons acting as a single divine principle, but each one of them performed this common work in accordance with his own personal property. Consequently, when we contemplate with wonder the universe in all its grandeur and beauty, we must praise the Holy Trinity. For Christians believing in one God who is Trinitarian communion suggests that the Trinity has left its mark on all creation. St. Bonaventure went so far as to say that human beings, before sin, were able to see how each creature testifies that God is three. The reflection of the Trinity was there to be recognized in nature when the book was opened to man and our eyes had not yet become darkened. The Franciscan saint teaches us that each creature bears in itself a specifically Trinitarian structure, so real that it can be readily contemplated, if only the human gaze were not so partial, dark, and fragile. In this way, he points out to us the challenge of trying to read reality in a Trinitarian key. The divine persons are subsistent relations, and the world, created according to the divine model, is a web of relationships. Creatures tend towards God, and in turn it is proper to every living being to tend towards other things, so that throughout the universe we can find any number of constant and secretly interwoven relationships. This leads us not only to marvel at the manifold connections existing among creatures, but also to discover a key to our own fulfillment. The human person grows more, matures more, and is sanctified more to the extent that he or she enters into relationships, going out from themselves to live in communion with God, with others, and with all creatures. In this way they make their own Trinitarian dynamism there, which God imprinted in them when they were created. Everything is interconnected, and this invites us to develop a spirituality of that global solidarity which flows from the mystery of the Trinity. 8. Queen of all creation. Mary, the mother who cared for Jesus, now cares with maternal affection and pain for this wounded world. Just as her pierced heart mourned the death of Jesus, so now she grieves for the sufferings of the crucified poor and for the creatures of this world laid waste by human power. Completely transfigured, she now lives with Jesus, and all creatures sing of her fairness. She is the woman clothed in the sun with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Revelations 12:1. Carried up into heaven, she is the mother and queen of all creation. In her glorified body, together with the risen Christ, Part of the creation has reached the fullness of its beauty. She treasures the entire life of Christ in her heart, and now that was Luke 2:19-51, and now understands the meaning of all things. Hence, we can ask her to enable us to look at this world with the eyes of wisdom. At her side, in the Holy Family of Nazareth, stands the figure of Saint Joseph. Through his work and generous presence, he cared for and defended Mary and Jesus, delivering them from the violence of the unjust by bringing them to Egypt. The Gospel presents Joseph as a just man, hardworking and strong. But he also shows great tenderness, which is not a mark of the weak, but of those who are genuinely strong, fully aware of reality, and ready to love and serve in humility. This is why he was proclaimed custodian of the universal church. He too can teach us how to show care. He can inspire us to work with generosity and tenderness in protecting this world which God has entrusted to us. 9. Beyond the sun. At the end, we will find ourselves face to face with the infinite beauty of God. So, Corinthians 13:12. And be able to read with admiration and happiness the mystery of the universe, which with us will share in unending plenitude. Even now we are journeying towards the Sabbath of eternity, the New Jerusalem, towards our common home in heaven. Jesus says, I make all things new, Revelation 21:5. Eternal life will be a shared experience of awe, and each creature, resplendently transfigured, will take its rightful place and have something to give those poor men and women who will have been liberated once and for all. In the meantime, we come together to take charge of this home, which has been entrusted to us, knowing that all good which exists here will be taken up into the heavenly feast. In union with all creatures, we journey through this land, seeking God, for if the world has a beginning, and if it has been created, we must inquire who gave it this beginning, and who is this Creator. Let us sing as we go. May our struggles and our concerns for this planet never take away the joy of our hope. God, who calls us to generous commitment and to give Him our all, offers us the light and the strength needed to continue on our way. In the heart of this world, the Lord of life, who loves us so much, is always present. He does not abandon us, nor does not leave us alone, for He has united Himself definitively to our earth, and His love constantly impels us to find new ways forward. Praise be to Him. At the conclusion of this lengthy reflection, which has been both joyful and troubling, I propose that we offer two prayers. The first we can share with all who believe in God, who is the all-powerful Creator, while the other we Christians ask for inspiration to take up the commitment to creation to set before us by the gospel of Jesus. A prayer for our earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty and not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. A Christian prayer in union with creation. Father, we praise you with all your creatures. They came forth from your all-powerful hand. They are yours, filled with your presence and your tender love. Praise be to you. The Son of God, Jesus, through you all things are made. You were formed in the womb of Mary, our mother. You became part of this earth. You gazed upon this world with human eyes. Today you are alive in every creature in your risen glory. Praise be to you. Holy Spirit, by your light you guide this world towards the Father's love, and accompany creation as it groans in travail. You also dwell in our hearts, and you inspire us to do what is good. Praise be to you. Triune Lord, Wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you and the beauty of the universe. For all things speak to you, awaken our praise and thankfulness. For every being that you have made, give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of the earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor and the earth are crying out, O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen. And then it says, given in Rome, in St. Peter's, on 24th of May, the solemnity of Pentecost in the year 2015, the third of my pontificate. Francis. Reader's Commentary. So, as I mentioned at the end of the first part of this, I'm reading this in preparation to go on a small conference where we'll have an audience with the Pope, and just seeking to understand how this applies to the work that I am doing in the happiness movement. And very much really enjoyed reading it, because it's just so nice to see the eloquence with which the Pope uses to show that interconnection between sustainability and happiness and well-being of all people. There were parts about the religious aspects of Catholicism that I grapple with and sort of tripped over and psychologically while I was reading it, but that doesn't mean to me that the other parts of this, and the majority of this, that I feel a great deal of resonance with. I loved the end where he is talking about the Holy Trinity and Mary and Joseph, and it's just this beautiful invocation of the spiritual and the sort of the dream worlds and the archetypes, and that Jung talks about. But it's living. He's like living it, and you kind of can, by reading it or maybe listening to it, you can really feel that living. He talks about the Holy Trinity and then Mother Mary and the fourth there, and Jung talks about the importance of 3 and of 4 and of completion. And the Pope is also talking about completion in a way of integrity and. Side notes, apologies for the mispronounced words. As I say, those come free. I don't charge for those. But the integral, the integrity. So being full, as we are meant to be, as I believe the Pope says, we are meant to be on this planet, really caring for each other and caring for the environment, above and beyond a number, a consumer, or even an individual. If you have listened this far, then wow, and thank you.